Okay, I think we're live. So, do you want to go ahead and share your example or whatever? I don't know if you read an article or did you just do a personal?
I did personal because it actually works really well since I do taxes. I'm like, yeah, this is sort of basically the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's hear it.
Okay, I'm just quickly getting the Google Doc up in case we need it.
Okay,
Uh,
well, while you're doing that, you want me to read mine so you don't have
no,
to.
I just got it ready. It should be in the chat.
Oh,
Um,
okay. Let me see. Oh, there we go.
okay. So mine is as a tax preparer, I try to write a return that conforms to tax law. There are some sections of the tax return that are cut and dry, and other sections that are not. The less cut and dry the section is, the easier it is to let the approval of the client affect my decision. In addition, the amount of time that I've known the client can affect my process. If I've worked with the client for years, I'm more willing to find a way to get favorable
Excuse me.
tax return. Yet, if it's a client that I've never met in person, it can be easier to get them a less favorable tax return.
All right. That sounds good. Well, I don't have a lot of financial things. Actually, I guess I could have probably used some business ones, but I was thinking more on just a personal level. So I guess I could change it if we needed to. I just thought of another one, but I did a situation with my son. Um, when my son entered the teacher's quorum at church, he had a wonderful reputation from the deacon's quorum advisors. At his first activity as a teacher, he was caught with two older boys who had made some bad choices. Since then, the teachers' quorum leaders have grouped the three boys together, and when one of them is involved, the other two get dragged in, regardless of what other boys or adults witness. He now has a bad reputation with the two leaders and is blamed for everything, a few times when he wasn't even at church. I think this is an example of ambiguity because they chose to interpret their first interaction with him as negative and automatically tied him to a couple of rough boys. Unfortunately, he cannot shake his reputation no matter how many other adults express concern of the obvious bias. So,
There you go.
but then I guess I'm biased as a parent.
Yep.
So, anyways, that was my example. But actually, while listening to yours, I was thinking that I thought of another example of, when we owned our business and somebody would call and complain, or, if there were any problems, I would be more willing to take off extra money, like give them an extra discount or throw in something extra if they were a regular customer. Whereas if it was their first time, I probably would be a little bit more, find out if I would be more scrupulous in determining if there really was a problem, if they're just trying to, mess
Yep.
with us, things like
I've
that.
seen that in my tax office. I'm not the manager of it, but I've kind of generally been the kind of second in charge.
Uh-huh.
But I've seen my manager give out discounts, and it's interesting to see those who have been with us for a while. She's more open to give them a bigger discount than someone who is just trying us for the first time, and you can kind of tell that they're like, oh, $150. I was thinking I'd spend only like 40.
Right.
And then it's like, yeah, you're not getting it for 40.
Right. So, I thought it was really interesting that, when we were reading the articles or that article, that even once the biases were pointed out, they still assumed the other people, the opposite side was biased, but not themselves. And I guess I kind of thought that once it was pointed out, oh yeah, this is our tendency to do this, they'd be more likely to reflect on themselves, and they just use that as ammunition against the opposite side to say, yes, they are being biased.
Yep.
But,
It's true. I've noticed it with myself, kind of reading that article. It's like, yeah, bias is a really hard thing to shake.
it is. I think it's kind of our natural. Well, I guess it is obviously natural if everybody does it. And it's hard when you're not even aware that it exists. You know what I mean? Like, when I was thinking, I've got to be honest. I'm not an accountant by any means, but I was thinking, I don't understand how bias, like they were reading the first two or three chapters, and I was going, yeah, they're just numbers. How can you misinterpret numbers? I always thought math was the one thing that was black or white. It's right or it's wrong. I didn't understand how.
Yeah, well, math is still the most correct. It's just all those extra principles that they add.
Yeah.
And it's like there's certain things you would think are cut and dry on the tax return, and then even just defining what's your income. There's
Yeah.
thousands of tax cases where people are fighting over, okay, this isn't really considered income and blah, blah, blah.
Hmm.
And
Well, it's true. And even like in the church, when we are supposed to say 10% tithing. So everybody interprets that different. Is that gross? Is that net? Some people say, well, yes, I pay on, the interest I earn on my accounts, and I pay on, all of these things too. And everybody interprets it a little bit differently.
it's true. They all do
So,
it.
yeah, I think even in our life, my husband and I, it's changed over the years, our interpretation of it.
No,
So,
it's true. One of the bishopric members in my YSA ward, we were talking about um, tithing basically, and he just retired from UPS. And I guess while he was working, he had his retirement account that was building up money and whatnot. And he was like, okay, well, what do I do? I mean, I'm earning money, but I can't touch any of that money yet. And
right.
his bishop at the time basically told him, like, well, you can't touch the money, you can't spend it. So, as if say it's like putting it off until you start receiving the money isn't a bad thing because, say you earn $100,000 that way, but you don't have 10 grand in your bank to
Right.
pay
Well,
tithe.
and it gets to a point, especially after you've had an account for 20 or 30 years and you're making more than you're ever putting in. I'm thinking there's no way we could afford to pay the, tithing on that. But then, we've also talked about, well, how much is, you know, let's say the company pays for part of our health insurance. We pay a part. So do we pay interest on or tithing on the portion that they paid also? Because it technically, I see that now. I don't think I realized that ahead of time, but yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah. And I think all of us, we probably try to tie it in a way that's more beneficial to us. And I'm sure there's some who they skew it towards, they think, oh, well, the more I pay in tithing, the more blessings, blah, blah, blah. And then
Right.
there's, of course, others that are like, well, I want to pay my 10%, but at the same time, it's like, I only want to pay the 10%.
Yep, yep.
And
It's
trying to,
interesting.
yeah.
So, all right. Well, do you want to kind of go through? Did you read over any of the questions ahead of time?
No, just because I thought it was probably the same as it usually is. I didn't bother, but
Uh huh.
I've got it open.
Yeah, I've got it open. Do you want to just kind of maybe read the first? I don't know. I guess maybe we can just go down the list or something. I think between the two of us, we probably can cover, I would guess, all of them.
Yeah, that's fine. Can read the
Okay.
first one. The title of this unit is Ethics, but according to the article you just read, at least in the case of auditors, teaching auditors about ethics will not have an impact on bias. The author suggests education that helps auditors understand the unconscious errors they make and the reasons they make them. For business students and others who will not be auditors, what kind of education, if any, would help future business professionals avoid bias? Is it pointless? Uh,
The correct answer is no.
yeah,
Um,
I don't know. I mean, just thinking of, is it pointless? I wouldn't say it's pointless, but at the same time, I think you try to beat yourself up because you're being biased. It's like you're always going to be biased.
well, I mean, I think, I mean, to tell you the truth, I think just having, like, reading this article and just bringing awareness to it, I think it's just a matter. I mean, if you don't know there's a problem, I mean, like I said, before I read this article, I never even thought about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, possibly reading articles or just bringing it up in different areas, and trying to be more consciously aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think we probably, as we start looking around, even after reading the article, I start noticing just little things within a family, or, you know what I mean? It's just brought more awareness. So I don't know. I think just maybe general occasional research or reminders.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
No, I agree. I mean, in taxes, I know. Um, oh, what was I just thinking of? Oh, there's a lot of times when I'm deciding if I can use something to my advantage or not. I have the question in my head: if the IRS asks about this, which way are they going to go?
Yeah.
And sometimes when you realize, okay, you may have to actually justify this position, then it makes you think a little bit harder. It's like, okay, can I justify this, or am I just putting a number there?
Right. Well, and when you say that, you could use it for almost any decision, whether it be, involved with a business or numbers, or, even just everyday life. If I have to be held accountable for this, am I going to be able to say, this is why I chose it?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. All right. Do you want to go to the next question?
Sure.
All right. I'll read this one if you want. The authors suggest that the status quo, the universally accepted practice in the United States of how audit firms are hired, paid, and work with the companies they audit, results in bad audits. Do you agree? Why do you think when Congress passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, there weren't more radical reforms like the ones suggested by the authors? Okay, so do you agree with it, first of all?
I mean, knowing finances a bit and how the industry works, I can see how if it's a client slash company doing it, that you are going to have that bias because you want to have your client get a good outcome so that way they potentially pay you more. And I think you'd almost
Mm-hmm.
have to almost completely get rid of privatized auditors and just have it. And even if you did government based, those auditors would probably side with the government side of things. And
That's
yeah,
true.
I
There's
mean,
still
it's,
going to be bias regardless of.
yeah, because I know audits tax wise, I mean, if you get the IRS auditor, they're obviously going to want to get more money towards the IRS. And someone like me would want my client. And even though the judge of the tax case may supposedly be unbiased, I'm sure, depending what background they have, they probably have a bias between one of the
And
two.
even their political standing and their own experiences, the people that have come before them, and whether they judge them,
Yeah.
honest or.
Yeah. So I don't know
Yeah.
if any certain law would change it, because even if you supposedly do all these things to make them unbiased, there's no real way. I mean, look at the Supreme Court. They try to make those justices unbiased, and yet in the election, we're talking about keeping,
Who's
the balance one way or the other.
right, right. I do think that the way it's set up, there is going to be the bias audits, but like you said, I don't know that how we can avoid that. I think no matter what rules there are, it's still going to happen to some degree, regardless of, how it happens. As far as why there weren't more radical reforms, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I wonder if they even thought about bias as being a problem, because right then they just saw it as a black and white fraud type issue. I don't know. Why don't you think there was more radical changes?
Um, I know it could be just kind of like how you and me are thinking. We don't really know of any concrete solution that would solve it. I could see lawmakers maybe saying, if we don't think what we are doing would change, then why bother adding,
A different
more
set of
process
problems.
to it? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that this is my bias, but I do think that as a whole, when people are, dishonest and they try to take advantage of it, when we just try and add more and more and more and more laws to it, it just, I wonder if we're losing the spirit of the laws so many times. But,
No, that's very true. I know even in just actual law, and heck, even in church law, there's some that are more, letter of the law, and some are more spirit of the law. And either way, you can still kind of get carried away.
yeah, my husband and I were actually just talking about that. We ran across a couple people in our ward that are very, very letter of the law, almost to such extremes that it doesn't seem feasible, And so I'm going, I don't think that's what they meant, but oh well. I
Well,
guess we'll find out eventually, right?
yep, I know. I remember thinking, having that whole issue, even with Christ there, it's like, well, gee, if Christ is in your midst and you still have those issues, what are we going to be?
Exactly. We are in for a world of hurt, aren't we, Michael?
Yep.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. We want to move on. I can read
Yeah. Why don't you?
Okay. The article is specifically about auditors, but most of the studies are about human nature in general, and a few are specifically about lawsuits. Do you think the bias that was discovered for plaintiffs and defendants leads to a flawed legal system? Why or why not? Since lawyers are advocates for their clients, how much do you think lawyers are affected by bias? Does this create a flawed system? What are the advantages and disadvantages of a system where a lawyer is hired to advocate on behalf of her client? That is a buttload of questions.
We'll take one at a time. Okay, so do you think the bias that was discovered for plaintiffs and defendants leads to a flawed legal system?
Uh, it could, but at the same time, there's still safeguards in that. Like, I know this last summer, I was actually a juror on a murder trial,
Oh,
which that was interesting. And I think if that case, if you said like it was just a judge making the decision and not a jury of 12, I could see there being bias, but at least when you have a group of people, even though
they
they're
all have their individual biases to kind of balance each other out.
right, exactly. So,
Well, and on top of that, when you have a lawyer fighting on each side, they each have their own bias, but they're against each other. It
mhm.
probably is more, it probably, I don't know, I would think maybe causes more balance.
No, it's true. And when the lawyers were picking the jury, of course, before we knew what exactly the trial was about, one of their main things was making sure what the biases were of potential jurors towards police, because a lot of the prosecution was just police officers testifying, and they
Mm-hmm.
wanted to make sure that you weren't just going to side with a police officer because he is police.
Right. Well, and that brings up a good point, and I hadn't thought about it, but I was a juror, and it was just for I mean, I don't even remember what it was for. It didn't last very long, but the defendant wanted to represent himself, and so they wanted. Looking back at it, I realized that they asked us questions that said, "Do you think, how do you feel about the defendant defending himself?"
Mhm.
And like, oh, and and they wanted to know that if I think it was because they didn't want it to be, um, like us to say, poor him. He doesn't have I mean, he doesn't have a legal background or anything. So we kind of have to give him a little bit of leeway. Are we going to be still make sure that we're holding him to the same standards, even though he's choosing to do that? So that's a really good point.
Mhm. No, I agree.
So,
Which that almost kind of leads into the next one of, since lawyers are advocates for their clients, how much do you think lawyers are affected by bias? Uh, and I think certainly lawyers can, especially when you kind of learn of all the evidence in one fashion.
mhm.
If the evidence you focus on is more so all good things towards your client, you're bound to think, oh, well, there's all this stuff showing that either they're guilty or not guilty.
Right.
So,
Well, what do you think happens? Like, I'm just thinking of like a criminal court. Well, what happens if a lawyer knows that, let's say he's guilty, he confessed that. Now the lawyer doesn't have to say anything, and isn't
mhm.
doesn't need to disclose that because that's you know client
Right.
privilege, but client attorney privilege. But do you think that would affect the bias then? Because if they know, I
I
mean, do you think they would get a not as good of a defense if someone didn't know?
I've thought about that because going back to my trial, just kind of a little bit of a background. At the time, it was a teenager, like 15, 16 years old. Long story short, because of issues with weed and whatnot. Um, this kid was kind of dragged in with another kid into the murder, and this kid, while he's being held by police, um, he confesses to the crime, and obviously the defendant's lawyer knew of this video and that it was going to come up in court. And we actually got a chance to talk with the lawyer after. He basically kind of said, it's like, how did you feel about defending something when you knew basically this home run was going to come out, and not much to defend against that, really.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, I think as long as you truly want to advocate for them, but at the same time, if you think someone's guilty or someone is, I kind of find it hard to believe that someone would be totally unbiased and still do everything for you.
Well, but then you have to realize that even if they knew that this person was guilty or felt that they were guilty, realistically, there still is an element of self-serving in having a bias for the lawyers, because their reputation is on the line too. Their future jobs, if people turn to them. So they still have an interest in winning the case. So maybe, it still is self-serving.
Well, and I've thought about that too, because the defendant's lawyer was actually a public defender. Mm-hmm. So I've wondered how that factors into things too, because public defender, they don't normally get fired because, they lose X amount of cases, unlike...
And they don't generally get promotions because they win.
Right. And so I could certainly see that for a private lawyer, but especially that whole idea of a public defender, that he's still going to have a job 10 years later, no matter what. But,
yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So actually, I think we covered a lot of those questions.
Yeah, that's what I was just looking at.
I think we did a pretty good job on that one.
Yeah, for the 8 questions that were in there.
All right. So the next question, can you think of situations outside of auditing where there are lots of opportunities for bias? What could you do to change the situation? I think that's a loaded question. I think just about everything we do has opportunity for bias in our relationships, in our, callings, in our, like we even talked about tithing, in our, everything.
It's interesting because with the World Series going on and everything, of course, when baseball's playing all their games, no one worries about things. But when it's the title game, all of a sudden everything is under the microscope.
Right.
Brought up the point of, because a strike zone is supposedly, it's altered slightly depending on the player, but for the most part, it's supposed to be a definite, it's either here or it's there, and just creating a system like in tennis where the computer decides if the ball touches the line, do that same thing for a strike zone.
Mm-hmm.
And just kind of hearing people say, it's like, oh, well, let the umpire still call it, because... And of course, you're going to go either way. If it's against your team, then you want to get rid of the umpire, but if he gives you a couple good calls your way, then you're like, oh, that's a great
He's a
umpire.
great one. Well, it was funny. Speaking of the World Series, we live in Ohio, so we've been to a couple Indians games, so we're kind of involved.
Hmm.
And we were commenting at Chicago. There was this one guy that always is sitting behind the base, and he's like 4 or 5 seats off to the right, and he's always wearing the same outfit. And it is so obvious. We just laugh at him because every time they throw a ball, no matter what the ump calls, if it's against, if it doesn't benefit the Cubs, he like throws his hands up and, I mean, it can hit the batter and he's still like, ah. And we were just going, and I mean, I don't know how you can do anything without a bias. I mean, and how do you avoid it or change it? I don't know. I mean, I think that's just our nature. Can you change it?
I mean, kind of thinking of that example, and if you do allow the computer to call it, there's still even that chance of bias of saying, okay, did the computer get the strike zone in the right parameters or things like that?
Right.
Heck, I remember, this is even a bigger can of worms in sports, but when college football had the BCS and half of the votes to determine who got to the title game were done by computers. And
Mm-hmm.
even the computers, because they have, of course, multiple computers voting, all of them came up with different answers. So it's like, okay, apparently even computers can
Yeah.
have some bias.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, part of me thinks to some degree, bias is what makes us individually us.
Hmm.
I mean, it's like, well, my husband and I can disagree on, where to spend our money on our budget. Well, that's, his experience with finances and money is different than my experience with money and finances. And so part of me says, is it all that bad? Because that's part of what makes us human. That's, you know what I mean? If we were all uniform and had absolutely no bias, I don't know what it would be like. Does that make sense?
No, I agree. I've thought about that, seeing all my friends now starting their own families and then seeing how they raise their kids. And of course, everybody has their 2 cents on how to raise a
Right.
kid, and everybody thinks everyone else's 2 cents are wrong if they go against.
Unimportant.
So, yeah, no, I kind of agree. I mean, we all have our biases, and I think it would be kind of bland. I mean, I don't know, if I just thought that there were no fans of any sports team whatsoever, that we just were completely individual, and we just thought, it's like, oh, well, I don't know. I mean, you can't even think of a
Yeah.
sports fan without any bias, really,
Right, right.
because location and what team the
Mhm.
parents were fans of and whatnot. Yeah.
So for me, I'm usually an underdog. I don't have a tendency to, vote for one team or the other. And I'm like, even with the World Series, I mean, I know we're in Ohio and I know that we've been to Indian games, but I wouldn't be terribly upset if the Cubs win because the poor people haven't won forever. You know what I mean? So that's just one of my biases. You know,
No, I
I,
agree. I mean, Cub fans are called the lovable losers. And now it's been talking, it's like, okay, let's say the Cubs win this World Series and another one within the next 4 years or something.
right.
It's like, okay, are Cubs fans okay going from lovable losers to basically fans of the Yankees or something like that?
Right, right.
So,
Well, and I even think, Well, you know what though, as far as Cleveland is considered, they took the NBA, so I'm like going, is that fair for one city to have two in the same year?
And then it's even more fun of one Cleveland team wins the title after being down 3-1, and
Yeah,
Cleveland championship could be lost because of giving up a 3-1. It's like
right.
if you tried to write a script to this year in sports, you'd be totally wrong in everything.
Yeah. Well, at least we don't have to worry about our Browns winning.
Yeah, if they win a
So,
game this year at all, that will be magic.
yeah. However, they are loyal fans. We've been to a few Browns games, and they are loyal. The poor people.
No,
Anyways, I think we're getting off subject, but
true, but it's biased.
but anyways, so
So next one, if you are an accounting major, what will you do about what you learned from reading this article? Which basically hits me on the head. I'm not sure the article did anything for one way or the other. I mean, kind of like we said before, it makes you aware of it, but even if you're aware, that doesn't necessarily show things are going to change.
right.
So I don't know. I could even say I'll try to be less biased, and I probably won't be.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the evidence has shown that that doesn't necessarily mean or do anything. So,
Mm-hmm.
so look, last question. Why do you think it's so difficult to overcome bias, even when you know about it?
I think it's just, I think it could even kind of go back to the principle of learning things little by little. I think when you learn things little by little, whether it be you learn to do taxes one way or you learn to like a sports team little by little in one way, that a lot of things aren't going to change that bias for you. If tonight the Cubs lose it off of a bad call, the Cubs fans, of course, are going to support their team, and Cleveland fans are going to say, hey, sorry, we still won it.
Yeah, it's not going to change, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult just because that's human nature. I mean, I think that's in a way, the way we've been since the beginning. I mean, we're mortal, we're flawed. I mean, I say flawed, but I don't know that I'd want to be truly unbiased. But I mean, I think that's just the way we are. I mean, I think we can try to alleviate at some degree by just taking in more information. I mean, I love the talk. Elder Uchtdorf gave a talk one time about like the different men that were blind men that wanted to, they had never seen an elephant, so they wanted to go and learn what an elephant was. And like one of them took the trunk and he described it, like this hose, this hollow, bendy hose. And the next guy, he felt the tail, and he's like, "Oh no, it's like a twig. It bends, but it's really thin." And then the guy that took the trunk or the leg, he's going, "No, it's like the trunk of a tree, solid." And and all of them were right, but they were limited because of what they could experience, what they could, what their experiences had been. And so I think because we have a very limited and almost finite knowledge in front of us, it's hard for us to overcome that. Experiences, you know.
No, I agree. I mean, I think it's not a bad thing that we are towards one way because of our background, but I don't know. At the same time, I've thought, is it a bad thing to have bias? And even on kind of deeper thought, after thinking of all this and thinking of bias for a couple hours, even Christ himself kind of has a bias when you think of it. He is the one person who has a perfect knowledge of each of us individually, and he wants to advocate for us come Judgment Day. And I'm sure he'd be more than willing to try and make sure to do everything he can for you, but at the same time,
Give us another chance. Give us a little bit of, yeah, maybe.
So,
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't know how long we've been talking. I'm guessing it's about 45, 50 minutes. I don't know what time we actually got started. So should we go ahead and start working on our paragraph?
Yeah, that works.
So we just have to write one paragraph on
what we basically gained from the discussion.
Important and interesting insights. Okay. So what were some of your interesting or personally, what were some of the things that you kind of got out of this? Maybe we can just bullet point it before we.
I would think just a question of, is bias a good or bad thing?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because from the article and things, when you just logically think about it, everybody just assumes it's a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? But it doesn't have to. So,
yeah.
So I just kind of put on there that, you know, kind of along that line too, that I think that bias is what makes us individuals and unique. So I think that was something that I kind of.
No, I agree. Yeah, yours was
okay.
Really similar.
I mean, I think maybe one of my whoops, I didn't mean to do that, but maybe one of my insights, it's like that I see there we go. One of my insights was that bias really exists in almost everything around us, everything and every action, every decision.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. I mean, how many different fields did we figure out? It's like, oh, yep, bias here, bias there.
Yeah. I mean, we talked a lot about even the ones that are in the church, you know, different beliefs and things. So
I think the other interesting thing was when we were trying to figure out if like there was anything Congress could do to get rid of bias.
Yeah.
And so maybe no clear answer to fixing bias.
At least in a work environment or a auditing standpoint, I guess is how they.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say probably